U.S. President Donald Trump's state visit to Japan is currently underway. Top of the agenda, trade, a topic that has troubled the two allies since Mr. Trump came to power. According to the U.S. trade representative, there is a $68 billion deficit when it comes to trade with Japan. But this issue is also crucial for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, as the U.S. is Japan's #1 export partner and is #3 for top imports. But that doesn't mean that Washington has the upper hand. The U.S. also relies heavily on Japan for trade. 4% of all U.S. exports flow out to Japan, and they also rely on their Asian ally for imports. Following a meeting with Mr. Abe, Mr. Trump expressed optimism about his goal of evening out their trade imbalance.
I think that we are very much discussing different things with Japan. We have an unbelievably large imbalance, as you know, trade imbalance, which has been there for many, many years, Japan having the big advantage. They are brilliant business people, brilliant negotiators, and put us in a very tough spot. But I think we will have a deal with Japan. Likewise, I think we will have a deal with China sometime into the future.
Now, in fact, America's trade history with Japan offers an insight into how the U.S. is currently dealing with trade imbalances. In 2018, the trade deficit with Japan stood at $57 billion. Now, it brings memories of the 1980s when the two industrialized nations were at loggerheads with each other in the last major trade war. In 1984, the U.S.-Japan trade deficit hit $37 billion. This meant that the U.S. bought far more from Japan than the other way around. In fact, Japan accounted for almost a third of America's total trade deficit that year, sowing the seeds for the great trade war of the 80s. So the U.S. took action to bring the deficit down, such as imposing tariffs as high as 100% on a range of Japanese goods, including cars. 5 of the world's then biggest economies, the U.S., Japan, the UK, France, and West Germany, also got together in 1985 and signed the Plaza Accord. This resulted in a huge depreciation of the greenback against the yen as well as the Deutsche Mark. Then in less than a year, the dollar fell by more than a third against the yen. So this meant that U.S. exports became cheaper, while Japanese goods became more expensive. While the trade war rhetoric tailed off, the deficit with Japan persisted. Which brings us back to this figure. Japan currently sells to the U.S. $57 billion worth of goods and services, more than the U.S. sells to Japan. So why is Donald Trump playing golf and making nice in Japan instead of engaging Tokyo in a trade war? Well, that's because, relatively speaking, it's now China that holds the lion's share of America's trade deficit. Among America's top 5 trade partners, China holds almost 2/3 of their combined deficit with the U.S., while Japan's share is now just at 12%. Well, we spoke to Mr. Kotaro Tamura, Adjunct Professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and he told us that even as Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talks trade with U.S. President, economic issues are tied in very much with regional security concerns.
I think this time Prime Minister Abe purchased the time. The time can be expensive, but for him, the biggest agenda is winning the election in August. He buy the time until the end of August. I understand that. It sounds a little bit selfish, but he needs to win because he might dissolve the lower house at the same time with the upper house. That's going to be the largest election in the history of Japanese politics. And his biggest agenda is a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendment, why? Because Prime Minister Abe's thinking, the largest challenge Japan is facing right now is not the economic issue, the security issues in the region. He wants U.S. to stay in the region. U.S. is gradually fading out in this region. But in order to keep U.S. in the region, Prime Minister Abe thinks Japan needs to do more collaboration with the U.S. That's the main part he wants to do the constitutional amendment. So he needs to pay the price, but I think the price can be politically reasonable.
Investors pricing in the trade talk optimism with Japanese stocks ending Monday in the green. The benchmark Nikkei closed up 0.31%. It's a welcome reprieve for the index, which is trading down almost 5% this month. The broader topics also following Wall Street gains gained almost 0.4%. Discussions between Donald Trump and Shinzo Abe buoying export-related stocks. Sony up 1.2%, while Hitachi rising 2%. Japanese automakers who have been threatened with U.S. tariffs also betting on trade relief. Tokyo up 0.8%. Nissan added 0.97%. The Japanese yen, well, traditionally a safe haven in times of volatility, lost to the dollar. It weakened to 0.2%. It is now priced at 109.49 cents to the U.S. dollar.